You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 25th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme.
I'm not a big fan of The Atlantic. It's not much of a magazine, but I know nothing about it.
Trump's dismissal aside, a major security breach has spilled into public view in the US. We'll look at the fallout from The Atlantic editor being texted the Trump administration's war plans and how European allies will respond. After that, we explore the threats journalists are facing during protests in Turkey with Reporters Without Borders, and then...
Even when someone has a good project, it's almost impossible to get the approvals to do it. So people are frustrated the government seems not to be able to deliver.
We speak to author Mark Dunkelman about how the U.S. is reshaping government operations. We'll also get some insights into Taiwan's hospitality industry and a roundup of food and drink stories with our very own host of the menu, Chiara Rimella. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. It was a shocking security failure made all the more embarrassing by the fact that it included a journalist. And not just any journalist, but the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine. Jeffrey Goldberg's explosive article yesterday documenting how the Trump administration accidentally texted him its plans to bomb the Houthis in Yemen has prompted a firestorm of criticism, calls for investigations, and comes at a time when Europeans and other allies were already rattled about sharing intelligence with the United States. Well, Monocle's security correspondent Gorana Grgić joins us now on the line for more on this. And Gorana, perhaps it is obvious to start here, but tell us why this is not just an embarrassing mistake. This is a major security breach.
You're absolutely right, Chris. So this is unprecedented breach of national security, and there's no way of sugarcoating it. The topmost ranking officials, the so-called principals of the National Security Council, were discussing sensitive war plans on an unsecured platform. And this included various types of operational details, from weapons, targets, and timing that veritably could have put American service members at risk. So, now when we are just going through all the reactions and reverberations from both within the administration as well as in the context of interbranch relations, so things that are happening on the kind of line between Congress and the White House, and then more broadly the media coverage, this is something that truly feels unprecedented. There hasn't been such a high level of communication and on such sensitive matters to the U.S. national security conducted in this way and then exposed basically to the public.
Gorana, you mentioned that this was on an unsecured platform, that being Signal, where these chats were happening. Are you able to shed any more light on that? I do wonder how common using something like Signal might be, or presumably it should not be used at all.
Well, the U.S. government actually has quite strict protocols when it comes to handling classified information. And of course, again, war planning would very neatly fit into this. So whenever officials who actually have clearance to deal with such sensitive data are involved in such communication, they should use secure channels such as those sensitive compartmented information facilities. So this is a mouthful, but these SCIFs, which basically would then be fully encrypted and would only go through government-approved channels. So apps like Signal or any other messaging application, while they might be encrypted, they don't meet the security standards that are required for classified discussions. So the use of any such kind of application for operational war planning is not just inappropriate then, but also so could be potentially illegal under different types of statutes. And what we've seen now in conversations that have been had over the past 24 hours, this is something that actually is strictly forbidden under the U.S. Espionage Act. So this is why a lot of intelligence and military professionals are expressing such outrage.
It could potentially be illegal, as you say there, and it could also have ramifications for allies, including here in Europe. I wonder if you could talk about what kind of reactions we might expect to a breach like this from America's allies.
You're absolutely right. And I think that you already alluded to some of the conversations that we've heard already happening over the past 2 months or so. So basically, whether it's under very sort of high level intelligence sharing agreements and sort of institutions basically that we have, such as the Five Eyes that covers essentially the Anglosphere of these five closest U.S. allies, over to various types of intelligence sharing that happen in the context of alliances, whether it's within NATO or other sort of bilateral relationships. And yes, for sure, we have heard this from a number of European capitals, not necessarily connected to this story, but again, all of this happening in the context of all the leaks and kind of declassification and sort of very generous granting of clearances that the incumbent U.S. administration has been engaged in, that basically allies are not feeling comfortable necessarily sharing the intelligence with the United States for the fear that we might see what we've just seen happening over the past day or so.
And just finally, Gorana, I know we've been talking mostly about the breach itself, but in terms of the substance of what was being discussed here, some of the comments, particularly between J.D. Vance, the vice president, and Pete Hegseth, the U.S. defense secretary, I suppose they confirm a disdain for European freeloading. There are these comments about why the Europeans can't be doing this that really goes beyond public pronouncements. Will Europeans have been surprised by that?
Well, when it comes to J.D. Vance, who, at least in the context of this particular back and forth on Signal, was kind of sounding almost as a voice of dissent, because basically he saw this operation as somehow being helpful to Europe, because, of course, the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea arguably matters much more to Europeans than the U.S. economically. So in that sense, he was saying that this wouldn't be necessarily on kind of the same track with the general messaging on Europe coming from the Trump administration, and then basically saying something to the effect that he feels just sort of sick of constantly bailing out Europeans, and, you know, the kind of standard lines that, again, I don't think is something that comes as a surprise to a lot of European leaders, given that J.D. Vance just a month and a half ago was in Munich delivering that very scathing speech. So it's very much par on course with that. But then ultimately he relented to sort of the plans that were already set in motion, saying to Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, that if he believes that this is the right way to go, then let's do it. But then that this is not something necessarily, again, that he would be all for.
Monocle's security correspondent Gorana Grgić, thank you very much for joining us. And now here's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Ukrainian and US delegations are scheduled to meet today in Saudi Arabia following Russia-US talks on Monday. At the top of the agenda is reportedly the revival of a limited Black Sea ceasefire proposal that Washington hopes will open the way for broader peace talks. A White House source said progress was being made and that a positive announcement was expected in the near future. A Palestinian Oscar winner has been detained in the occupied West Bank following outbreaks of violence between Israeli settlers and Palestinian activists, according to witnesses. Hamdan Balal, who was one of 4 co-directors of the documentary No Other Land, had his house surrounded by settlers during an attack in the village of Susia on Monday night. Co-director Yuval Abraham said Mr. Balal had been beaten and taken by soldiers whilst in an ambulance, but this has been disputed by Israel. And Brazil's Supreme Court will begin deliberations today to determine if former President Jair Bolsonaro and his closest aides should stand trial for allegedly attempting a coup after his electoral defeat in 2022. A 5-justice panel is expected to decide by tomorrow whether to hear the charges that were filed last month. Despite mounting legal challenges, Bolsonaro maintains his intention of running for office again. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Last year was a record year in terms of detentions of journalists around the world, led by countries including China, Myanmar, Russia and Israel. But as of this week, Turkey may have crept up that list because among the more than 1,000 people arrested during protests this weekend were at least 8 journalists and photojournalists, according to a Turkish media workers union, which accused the government of an attack on press freedoms and the people's right to learn the truth. Well, I'm joined now by Fiona O'Brien, who is the UK Bureau Director of Reporters Without Borders. Fiona, thanks very much for coming on the show. What do we know, first of all, about these journalists who were arrested during these protests in Turkey, the protests themselves, of course, against the jailing of Istanbul's mayor?
Yeah, we've seen a real uptick in violence against journalists and arrests in the last few days since the protests began, which is, of course, deeply worrying. You mentioned arrests. According to our information, there have been at least 5 journalists arrested across the country. 3 of those were released this morning, but under judicial control. So we still wait to see what charges will be brought against them. And then in addition to those arrests, there's been some really serious police violence against journalists. So we've seen at least 10 journalists assaulted, and we're talking about, one ended up in hospital with a broken nose, another was punched in the head, and another talked about being kicked and clubbed. These are journalists who are showing their camera gear and their equipment to riot police and explaining clearly that they are journalists. Dozens of journalists have been targeted with tear gas and rubber bullets. And then alongside that violence and those arrests, we've seen a number of other sort of familiar tactics being used. Turkey's Radio and TV Supreme Council, for example, has threatened TV channels which are seen as criticizing the government or the judiciary, threatening them with big fines, with license revocation. Several channels were sanctioned with substantial fines on the 20th of March. We've also seen some bandwidth throttling. So that's where platforms like Instagram or WhatsApp or Facebook are disrupted. That particularly happened in the first days of the protests, making it harder for journalists and also civil society actors to communicate. So we've seen this real sort of all-round tactics trying to stop independent journalism from being able to cover what's actually happening on the streets and communicate that to civilians in Turkey.
Fiona, you say these are familiar tactics that are being used. Are they familiar in Turkey itself, or is there a different character in terms of what you're seeing happening in that country at the moment?
Yeah, so I would say that definitely they're familiar in Turkey. And the backdrop to this is that there's been more than a decade of media repression under President Erdogan. Around 90% of national media in Turkey is controlled by the government. Since he came to power as president, we've seen 5 journalists killed. We've seen more than 130 imprisoned. We've seen wide-scale judicial harassment of journalists, the use of anti-terrorism laws, online censorship. So a raft of techniques that have been used. In fact, the last time we saw such enormous protest demonstrations in Turkey in 2013, at the time Erdogan was still prime minister. But between May to September then, we saw 150 journalists attacked with almost complete impunity. So these things aren't unfamiliar. That said, there's been a large and very alarming spike in violence and arrests in the last few days. So what we're seeing is familiar tactics, if you like, but being used afresh.
And what can you say about Reporters Without Borders activities? I'm curious, I guess, what kind of recourse journalists will have if they are in detention, what kind of support groups like Reporters Without Borders are able to provide, and also just to document what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, you make a really important point there because documentation is the first and very important step. One of the reasons why this kind of anti-journalist action can continue, and we're talking about things that happened a decade ago and still continue today, is because of the climate of absolute impunity. Those who are responsible for this kind of violence are not identified and then brought to justice, and that cannot be allowed to continue because impunity is effectively a passport to further oppression. So documentation is a very big, very important and large part of what we do. As you can imagine, the sort of process of verification and cross-checking facts and everything can take some time, but we're very involved in doing that. In addition, of course, we can also support journalists where possible through their court cases, solidarity, providing them with equipment, with training. There's a whole raft of things we do at RSF to support journalists in their day-to-day work.
And when it comes to mentioning impunity there of governments, I do wonder as well if, given the increase that we have seen in detentions, has that and sort of attacks on a free press in lots of different parts of the world, has that in itself given governments a certain emboldening impunity to continue with this? And how do you go about combating that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's it's obvious to some extent, but we have definitely seen a rise in sort of authoritarians repressing journalists over recent years and decades. There's a sort of emboldening effect, like you say, and I think we can't discuss this today in the world without mentioning also the actions that we've seen being taken by the Trump administration in the United States, which of course are a dream to authoritarian leaders. Watching, on this most enormous of world stages, the Trump administration targeting Voice of America, targeting the Associated Press and so forth. There's this sort of permissive feel in terms of pointing the finger at journalists, accusing anybody who is seen as critical of a government, largely because they're doing independent reporting rather than actual criticism, as sort of being somehow responsible or politically implicated. Journalism is not a crime. Journalists are there to provide independent information so that citizens can understand what's happening around them and participate fully in civic society. They play an absolutely vital role, and it's essential really at this very dangerous moment for press freedom that the international community steps up and does its job to call out repression where we see it.
Fiona O'Brien of Reporters Without Borders, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. President Donald Trump and Elon Musk's efforts to dramatically slim down the U.S. government have prompted questions not only about their immediate effect on the U.S. ability to run itself, but on future provisions for the country's infrastructure. Mark Dunkelman is an author and fellow at Brown University, and in his new book, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back, he talks about what stops us from getting things done and how we can regain our confidence. Mark spoke to Monocle's Seattle correspondent Gregory Scruggs, who began by asking Mark why indeed nothing seems to function anymore in the United States.
Things don't work because about 50 years ago, Americans saw the way that the old establishment had been coercive, abusive, had led the country wrong, and decided to begin putting up guardrails that would prevent further abuse. And so for 50 years, we've created new hurdles, whole new gauntlets to make it impossible for people to do bad things, like tear down a downtown in favor of new building, or to build a highway through a vibrant neighborhood, or to stomp across a vibrant forest. And the result now is that even when someone has a good project, or a project where you need to take down a few blocks in order to build some important infrastructure, a high-speed rail line, a transmission line, new housing, it's almost impossible to get the approvals to do it. So people are frustrated the government seems not to be able to deliver.
Are there particular infrastructure projects or big ideas in American life that have floundered that seem to be emblematic of this problem of nothing working?
Republican Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker signed a law trying to green the Massachusetts grid. And he was going to do it two ways. One was with wind energy built off the southern coast of Massachusetts, and two was to draw power down from hydro, dam-driven power from Quebec. But in order to get the power from Quebec into the Massachusetts grid, he needed to build a transmission line through one of the state's that sit between Massachusetts and Canada, which is New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. The first bid was from New Hampshire, and New Hampshire was all into it until they realized that the transmission line was going to go across the White Mountains. They didn't want that, so they rejected it. They went to Maine. Massachusetts offered incredible subsidies to Maine to get the transmission line going. They got sign-off from all sorts of towns in between that would have housed the new transmission line. It is now almost a decade later. The transmission line has not been built. There was a public referendum, there was siting issues, there were negotiations, there were just an innumerable number of hurdles to clear. And so what should be a fairly simple project, all designed to reduce carbon emissions, was essentially halted by a bunch of environmentalists who didn't want a transmission line to be cut through the Northwoods of Maine. But broadly, you see the housing crisis today. That's a crisis of us not having built enough homes. That's not because people don't want to build homes. It's not because there isn't money on the sidelines waiting to build homes. It's because the people who would build the homes can't get the approvals to do it. Same is true on high-speed rail. There's no reason for China and Europe to have high-speed rail lines that are the world's envy, and for the United States, the most sophisticated, most powerful economy in the world, not to be able to have a single high-speed rail line built in the country. It's true in the case of clean energy. We've got all these new clean energy resources. We've got wind energy, we've got solar, we've got hydro, but we can't get the energy to the places where people are using it because we can't find ways to build the transmission lines that would bring the power to the places where it would be expended. So in one realm after another, we're simply not able to get the projects done that would drive progress.
Have there been any meaningful attempts to reform the too many vetoes, too many guardrail system predicament that we find ourselves in prior to the election of the current administration?
Yes. I mean, the short answer to that is yes. There was a bill that died right before Trump was elected to speed energy transmission approvals. These sorts of issues have come up sort of on the periphery of broader debates about things like the Inflation Reduction Act. Like, people are on the margins aware of this. The broader notion that progressivism needs to evolve to embrace the idea that we're going to ratify hard trade-offs and going to have to metabolize the frustration that people have that their neighborhood is going to be adversely affected by whatever it is, a new housing project, a new transmission line, a new rail project. Whatever you say, the progressive view for the last 50 years has been we don't want anyone to be inconvenienced by progress. And the truth is that progress always comes with some degree of inconvenience.
So that brings us to the present day, where the current occupants of the White House, the Trump administration and the sort of unelected role of Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency are taking this kind of slash and burn approach of reducing the federal workforce as fast as they can, indiscriminately, without any regard, so it seems, for specific tasks. Is this kind of scorched earth approach, to what extent is the progressive veto system partly responsible for generating the political appetite for this kind of scorched earth approach?
I think it is, if not wholly responsible, just broadly responsible. The general frustration that the public has that the government doesn't work is an invitation for the public to support something other than the party of government, which is the Democrats. We, the Democrats, are the party of government. Government doesn't work. And for us, that is a terrible political liability.
The author Mark Dunkelman there in conversation with Gregory Scruggs. His book, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back, is out now. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Returning now to the world of hospitality, because Taiwan's hotel industry has been facing some challenges in the past year. Domestic revenues have been falling nearly 11% as many Taiwanese are heading abroad and fewer tourists are coming to the island. Instead, a number of Taiwanese hotel chains are increasingly relying on outposts such as Japan. Well, I'm joined now by Stephen Crook, web content manager for Life of Taiwan and author of the Brat Travel Guide to Taiwan. Stephen joins us from Tainan. And Stephen, good to have you on the show. Prices for rooms in Taiwan have been falling, hotel prices for rooms. This is part of the explanation for the drop in revenue, but what's the cause?
The cause basically is fewer people are staying in hotels. So even though last year a record number of foreigners stayed in hotels, Taiwanese are staying away from hotels in their own country. They prefer to go abroad.
And what explains that? Why the sudden shift, as it were, to moving abroad rather than staying at home?
Well, it hasn't been a very sudden shift. Before the pandemic, this was already starting to happen because there's a perception in Taiwan, and it's an accurate perception, that hotels here are unnecessarily expensive. So people prefer to go to places like Japan, where the hotels are no more expensive or sometimes very slightly cheaper than Taiwan, but the quality is a bit higher.
Well, that would suggest, I suppose, that there is a positive to this, or maybe just a natural correction. Or how can you describe, I guess, how Taiwan's own hotel industry is responding to this drop in revenue?
Well, it is a natural correction in many ways, but quite a few people in the industry worry the room rates going down a little bit will be just enough to push some hotels out of business, but won't be enough to really change consumer behavior. So the result will just be some hotels going bankrupt and Taiwanese generally preferring to go abroad.
And talk more generally about, I guess, the other response to this, which is Taiwan's hotel chains going abroad themselves and, for example, being active in Japan. Will that help?
It will help those companies, but it won't really help the hotel scene here in Taiwan because there are still a lot of independent hotels, a lot of smaller businesses, and they are the ones who are going to really, face the crunch if prices continue to go down.
And I understand this is something that the government is involved in as well, also particularly on the sustainability aspect of this. Tell us what's happening on that front to try and promote tourism to Taiwan.
Well, the government got involved with hotels because of the perception of high prices. So before the pandemic, the government was actually encouraging companies to open more hotels to increase the supply of rooms. In the hope that it would bring room prices down a bit. But now the emphasis of the government is more on making hotels sustainable. So, for example, hotels are not allowed to give out disposable toiletries. There's a push for certification. Part of this, I think, is just the global trend of trying to make tourism more sustainable. Part of it is, the government's own green agenda.
Stephen Crook in Tainan, thank you very much for joining us. This is The Briefing. You are back with The Briefing, and finally on today's show, it is time for a roundup of food and drinks news. And I'm very excited to be joined right here in the studio by Chiara Rimella, the host of The Menu on Monocle Radio. Good to have you here, Chiara.
Always a joy to speak to you, Chris.
It's been a little while since we've spoken and done a food and drinks roundup specifically like this. I'm very excited. Tell us.
I'm always focused on this stuff, so I hope to bring you what...
You are fully focused, yes, exactly. And you're going to start with restaurants and social media and some trends you've spotted there in terms of, I guess, how restaurants are projecting themselves these days. There's a lot of content creation out there.
Yeah, this I think is very interesting because it is no news that restaurants have to market themselves in order to fill tables. But I think the dynamic between that kind of marketing aspect and how much time is actually being invested in creating these videos and these accounts of life in the restaurant has really skewed, transforming certain restaurants into almost like a factory for this content before they are a restaurant themselves. I think it is remarkable when we ask ourselves how do restaurants actually fill tables nowadays, the FT has done a really interesting sort of investigation in this, bringing up a lot of different examples of what has effectively had an impact on bookings for these restaurants. And you would think that the answer would always be kind of going viral on social media platforms, but it not always is. Sometimes it is, and we can say that because we've got some restaurants around here in the Marylebone area where there's queues around the block sometimes, and you know that that's because they've gone viral on TikTok and things like that. But the FD investigation is interesting because, yes, it does say that for some restaurants, for some audiences, the kind of snappy video is the thing that works. But for others, it was actually the reviews in the long-standing newspapers. For others, it was winning a Michelin star. For others, it actually was almost like the opposite effect, where if you keep a lot of the mystery and you let people having to go and create buzz around the sort of the word of mouth, like inaccessibility of it, that can also work.
Well, that's the one I was wondering about. Whatever happened to sort of word of mouth and that aspect of this? Is it no longer that restaurants want this to be something that happens kind of, because people are reviewing their stuff and saying this is a place you should go?
Well, obviously, I suppose that's the dream, but restaurants are under a huge amount of pressure right now because a lot of them are genuinely at the risk of going out of business, and it is a serious problem. And you see certain restaurants that do become hyped, and those are the ones that have bookings filled up for months and months and months, where others are genuinely struggling to see if they can make it to the end of the month. We had the people who run Goodbye Horses in the studio for the menu not too long ago, and they're one of the case studies brought by this FT article. And they genuinely didn't expect it. They didn't engineer it to be like that. They have very, very small social media presence, and it so happens that this magic formula won, and people started going, and it became hugely popular, even though it has very little public presence. Meanwhile, conversely, you get people who genuinely do need that exposure because it has saved them from the brink of disaster. And there are certain examples of restaurants perhaps outside of the capital where this has happened.
Well, let's move on to another story. We're going to go to Paris, and you want to look at some old school cooking, I suppose.
Yeah, again, I suppose this is yet another example of what the crunch on prices is doing to both customers and restaurants. There is a huge comeback in the form of the bouillons, the old school, I suppose, eateries in Paris, which are even more approachable than your bistros. There are places where you can go and have a really cheap meal, very quick, based on this very fast turnaround of diners, huge dining rooms. So it really is quick, efficient, in, out. And it's a kind of eatery that was really popular in the previous kind of century, I suppose. But it turns out that in 2017, there was only really one bouillon left in Paris. And since then, they have been picked up. New ones have opened. One specifically opened in 2021, the Bouillon République, which is quoted in a Le Monde article. And opening in 2021, in 2024, it saw a growth of 10%. Not huge, but in the context of how much restaurants are feeling the crunch right now, still really remarkable. And they're saying they have huge queues outside of the door. People, students, but families, but also just people who are after this different kind of experience for eating. Not just a cheapness, but I think also there is a bit of a shift in terms of being willing to have a more traditional, hearty, sort of filling lunch. We're seeing this in London as well, with this sort of revival of old school French cooking, where perhaps our appetite for super healthy kind of salady lunches is not quite so much on the upswing anymore, and people are rediscovering the hearty, the buttery, the really filling type of old school French lunch.
I think I very much look forward to visiting one of those the next time that I'm in Paris. But finally, Chiara, we also wanted to talk about this rise of what's called here the mid-strength drink. It's sort of alcohol, but not quite alcohol, not zero alcohol, somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting, but because obviously we have seen a huge boom in alcohol-free drinks coming onto the market, but we're sort of seeing like a course correction now where people perhaps don't necessarily want to go full alcohol-free, because there's a reason why people have been drinking alcohol for centuries, because there is a fun element to it. And if you're
all trying to get that little bit of a buzz that just doesn't go quite too far.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting that it's difficult to define what really constitutes a mid-strength drink. Like arguably session IPAs have been existing for quite a long time. But I suppose what is now called the small beer, so like a 2-3% type of beer, there is a report out in the UK that's saying, although it is a report that's published by a number of companies who operate in this kind of mid-strength market, so we have to take it, as it comes.
There's also traditions like white wine spritzers in other places.
Yeah,
but not
exactly.
Here in the UK.
But here in the UK, 50% of drinkers would have 2 mid-strength drinks over 1 full-strength one. I think, again, this is a cultural thing, because you mentioned the spritzer, because you're kind of from a Middle European background. For
yes,
us,
exactly. We're more familiar for this stuff, yeah.
Exactly. For us in Italy, it sort of is about, having aperitivo with a couple of grissini, maybe like a little snack. So it's not just straight to pub like it is here in the UK, 3-4 pints after work and just like not really remembering what it was that you had to do in the morning afterwards. I feel like this movement towards mixed strength drinks might also be kind of related to the cultural habits around drinking here in the UK. But also
that's very diplomatically put.
Yes. So, I don't know, maybe just a little bit of bread alongside your glass of wine and do it like the Italians do. You'll be dandy.
Bit of bread, maybe a little bit of mineral water added to the drink. You'll be fine. Chiara Rimella, host of The Menu, thank you very much for joining us. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Monica Lillis and Ryuma Takahashi. Our researcher was Francesca Jilks and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.